Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. If you've found your way here, you're probably winding down for the night. Maybe you're already settled in, the lights are low, and you just need something calm and interesting to listen to as you drift off. That's exactly what this is. Tonight, we're going to spend a long, unhurried time with the life of someone who lived a very long time ago. Someone whose name you might not recognize right away, but someone whose life, when you sit with it quietly, turns out to be one of the most remarkable of the entire medieval world. Her name was Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. She was a Norse woman. She lived in a time when the world was smaller in some ways and much larger in others. A time when the sea was both a barrier and a road, when people crossed vast stretches of open ocean in wooden ships, guided by stars and instinct and the feel of the water beneath them. Gudrid was one of those people. She crossed more oceans than almost any other woman of her age. She stood on the shores of North America nearly 500 years before Columbus was born. She gave birth to a child in the New World. She walked the roads of medieval Europe as a pilgrim. And in the end, she returned home to a quiet life in Iceland, where she lived out her final years in peace. There's something I find gently extraordinary about her story, not in a loud or dramatic way, more in the way that a life, when you follow it from beginning to end, can leave you feeling quietly amazed at how much one person experienced. Gudrid wasn't a queen. She wasn't a warrior. She didn't lead armies or build empires. She was, in many ways, an ordinary woman living in extraordinary times, who found herself again and again at the edge of the known world. I find her life to be the kind you can return to slowly. There's always something new to notice, some small detail that you hadn't quite held before. So let's settle in together and follow her. From the very beginning, Gudrid was born around the year 985. That's our best estimate. She was born in Iceland, which at that point had only been settled for about 100 years. Iceland was a young society when Gudrid came into the world. It had been discovered and slowly populated by Norse settlers, mostly from Norway, who had begun arriving in the late 800s. By Gudrid's time, there were perhaps 20 or 30,000 people living on the island. It was a hard place to live, but a vivid one. The landscape was dramatic. Volcanoes and glaciers, long dark winters and summers, with almost no darkness at all. The Norse settlers had carved farmsteads out of the hillsides and valleys, raising livestock, fishing the cold waters, and building the beginnings of a society that was unlike anything else in the medieval world. Iceland had no king. It was governed by a system of chieftains and councils. Disputes were settled at regional assemblies, and once a year, people gathered at a great national assembly called the Althing, where laws were debated and judgments were made. It was a world that valued certain things above others. Reputation mattered enormously. So did kinship. So did the sea. Almost everyone in Iceland in Gudrid's time was connected to the ocean in some way. And Gudrid, from the very beginning, was no different. Her father was a man named Thorbjorn. He was a farmer of some standing, not wealthy in any grand sense, but respectable. He had land, livestock, and a good name, and he was devoted to his daughter. We don't know the name of Gudrid's mother with certainty. She doesn't appear clearly in the sources we have. What we do know is that Gudrid grew up in a household that was shaped by her father's character. Thorbjorn was a generous man. or at least he was remembered that way. He was the kind of man who valued his friendships, who kept an open table, and who felt deeply the weight of his obligations to others. Gudrid grew up in the Snæfellsnes Peninsula of western Iceland. It's a striking part of the country, a long finger of land extending westward into the sea, dominated at its tip by a great glacier-capped volcano. The views across the water from that peninsula stretch toward the open Atlantic, toward Greenland, toward the horizon where people were beginning to understand there was something more. She would have been raised in the customs and rhythms of Norse farm life, the keeping of animals through the long winter, the cutting and drying of hay in the short, warm months, the mending and weaving that filled the indoor hours, the telling of stories in the long, dark evenings when the firelight was the center of everything. She would have learned to spin, to weave, to manage a household. These were the core skills expected of a woman of her background. But she was also growing up in a time and a place that was alive with something else. There was a restlessness in the Norse world of that era, a hunger for new land, a willingness to sail into the unknown and see what was there. That spirit was very much part of the air that Gudrid breathed as a child, and it would shape everything that followed. By the time Gudrid was a young woman, the world around her was changing in ways that would affect her deeply. Iceland itself was going through a significant shift. Around the year 1000, Iceland officially converted to Christianity. The decision was made at the Althing, though in practice, many people had already encountered the new faith through their travels and trading connections with the rest of Europe. This was not a simple or entirely peaceful transition. There were people who held firmly to the old beliefs. The old Norse gods had been part of life for generations. Odin, Thor, Freya. The rituals and customs connected to them were woven into everyday existence. The sources that tell us about Gudrid's life are the Icelandic sagas. These are long prose narratives that were written down in the 13th century, though the events they describe took place much earlier, around the year 1000. The two most important sagas for Gudrid are the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These are remarkable documents. They were composed from a mix of oral tradition, family memory, and storytelling. They're not histories in the modern sense. They're more like carefully shaped accounts of what people remembered and valued, and they both place Gudrid at the center of the great Norse exploration of North America. But before we get there, we have to follow her through the early turns of her life. As a young woman, Gudrid came into the orbit of Leif Eriksson's family. Leif was the son of Eric the Red, the man who had colonized Greenland. And it was through this connection that Gudrid's life began to move outward, toward the wider world. Her first marriage, as recorded in the sagas, was to a man named Thorir. He was a Norse trader. The accounts tell us that Gudrid and her father, Thorbjörn, had been at sea, making their way toward Greenland when they encountered Thorir. The journey itself was difficult. There were hardships at sea. There was illness. These were the ordinary dangers of the Norse world. And it is around this time, in the early years of Gudrid's life as a young woman, that we begin to see her character more clearly. In the sagas, she is consistently described as wise, composed, and capable. She is never a passive figure. Even in difficult circumstances, she is present, thoughtful, and steady. That steadiness would carry her through everything that came next. Her first marriage did not last long. Thorir died. The sagas don't give us a great deal of detail about how or exactly when. What they tell us is that the journey toward Greenland was marked by hardship, and that illness claimed lives along the way. Thorir was among those who did not survive. Gudrid found herself a widow at a young age. In the Norse world, that was not an uncommon situation. Life was uncertain. The sea was dangerous. Illness came quickly and without warning. Widowhood was something many women faced, often more than once. What is striking about Gudrid is not that she found herself in this situation. It's how she moved through it. She did not disappear from the story. She did not become a small figure in someone else's account. She remained present. She remained capable. And in time, her life opened again towards something new. Greenland was where the next chapter of Gudrid's life began to take shape. She and her father Thorbjörn eventually made it there. The crossing of the open sea between Iceland and Greenland was one of the great challenges of the Norse world. It was several days of sailing across cold, unpredictable water, with no landmarks to guide the way. The navigators of that era relied on the position of the sun, the stars, the color of the water, the behavior of birds, and the direction of swells beneath the hull. When they arrived in Greenland, they entered a world that was still very new. Eric the Red had established the first Norse settlements in Greenland only a decade or so before. There were two main settlement areas, one in the west and one further east along the coast. These were small communities of farms, spread out across the fjords, where the land was suitable for grazing. It was not an easy place to live. The climate was harsher than Iceland. The growing season was short. Timber was scarce, because Greenland had very few trees, and almost everything made of wood had to be imported or salvaged. The settlers were resourceful people, as Norse people tended to be. They hunted, they fished, they kept cattle and sheep in the sheltered valleys. They traded with passing ships, but it was a life lived close to the edge. There was never quite enough of anything, and the winters were long and deeply cold. Gudrid and her father arrived into this world and found their footing among the community there. The sagas place them in connection with the household of Eric the Red himself, which was a prominent one. Eric was a powerful figure in Greenland, forceful, experienced, and well established. His son Leif had recently returned from a voyage of great significance. Leif Eriksson had sailed west from Greenland and found land. New land. Land that no Norse person had seen before, or at least land they had not yet settled. He had come back with reports of forests and meadows and rivers, of a place that seemed, at least from his brief visit, to be fertile and abundant. The name that would attach itself to this land was Vinland, and it was Vinland that would soon pull Gudrid westward into history. Before that journey, though, there was a winter in Greenland that Gudrid would not forget. The sagas describe a time of hardship, a famine of sorts, or at least a severe scarcity. The settlements were struggling. Food was running low. The community was under strain. In this difficult time, a seeress came to the settlement, a woman who practiced the old Norse art of prophecy. She was called a völva. These were women who traveled between communities, performing ceremonies of divination. They were respected and also treated with a certain careful deference. The old beliefs in prophecy and fate ran deep in Norse culture. even as Christianity was beginning to take hold. The seeress was received with ceremony. A ritual was prepared, and the sagas tell us that Gudrid, despite now being a Christian, played a role in this ceremony. The ceremony required someone to sing a particular kind of song, a chant that was part of the old tradition. A ward song, it might be called. Something that helped create the right conditions for the seeress to do her work. Gudrid had been taught this song as a child. She knew the words. She hesitated. She was Christian now, and this was not a Christian practice. But she was persuaded, perhaps by the situation, perhaps by the needs of the community around her, perhaps by her own sense of what the moment required. She sang, and the ritual proceeded. It's a small moment in the larger sweep of her life, but it stays with you, somehow. There is something very human about it. A woman caught between two worlds, between the old faith and the new, between what she had been taught to believe and what the people around her needed from her. She chose to help. The seeress, once the ceremony was complete, gave her prophecy. She spoke of the community's future. She offered words about the coming year. She predicted that the hardship would ease. And then she turned to Gudrid specifically and spoke of her fate. The prophecy was a good one. She told Gudrid that she would make a fine match in Greenland, that her life would take her far, that she would have many descendants, and that those descendants would be numerous and distinguished. We don't know how Gudrid received these words. The sagas don't tell us what she felt in that moment, listening to a seeress speak of her future in the firelit dark of a Greenlandic winter. But the words, as it turned out, were not wrong. Her second marriage came not long after that winter. His name was Thorstein Eriksson. He was a son of Eric the Red, which made him the brother of Leif. He was, by the account of the sagas, a good man, well regarded, strong, the kind of person who inspired confidence in those around him. The match must have suited Gudrid well enough. She and Thorstein were married, and they settled into life in Greenland together. Thorstein was drawn, as his brother Leif had been, toward the idea of sailing west. The reports of Vinland were still fresh. There was talk of another expedition, of following the route that Leif had pioneered and seeing what could be made of the new land. Thorstein organized a voyage. It did not succeed. The ship set out. The sea did not cooperate. They were blown off course, driven by weather and currents into confusion. After a difficult season on the water, they returned to Greenland without having reached Vinland at all. It must have been a deflating experience. The sea had simply not allowed it. They spent the following winter in the western settlement of Greenland, staying with another household there. And then something happened that would take Gudrid through another loss. Illness came to that household. It moved through the people there with quiet speed. Several died, and among them was Thorstein Eriksson. Gudrid was a widow again. She had now lost 2 husbands in the space of a few years. She was still a young woman. She was far from her family home in Iceland. She was in Greenland in the cold, in the aftermath of illness, holding whatever steadiness she could find within herself. The sagas give us a strange detail from this time. They tell us that after Thorstein died, his body seemed to stir, that he sat up and spoke, that he addressed Gudrid with final words meant for her alone. What exactly he said varies a little between the 2 versions of the story, but the general sense of it is that he had words of comfort for her, words about the future, a kind of farewell that carried something of reassurance in it. Whether we take this as a supernatural event, as a dying man's final consciousness, or as a story shaped by grief and memory and the beliefs of the time, it is a striking detail. The sagas preserved it because it mattered to someone, because it said something true about the weight of that moment and about Gudrid's place in it. She was, again, beginning again. She returned to the eastern settlement of Greenland after Thorstein's death, back into the main community, back into the life of the farms and the fjords. And it was there that she met the man who would take her to the edge of the world. His name was Thorfinn Karlsefni. He was an Icelander, a merchant, a man of substance and reputation who had sailed to Greenland with a trading ship and a crew. He was known as a capable man in every sense: practical, experienced at sea, decisive. He arrived in Greenland as a trader, stayed through the winter as a guest of Eric the Red's household, and somewhere in that long, dark season, he and Gudrid found each other. The sagas describe it with a certain directness. Karlsefni was drawn to Gudrid. He asked Eric the Red for her hand in marriage. Eric gave his blessing, though the decision, in practice, rested with Gudrid herself. She agreed. They were married during the winter feast, a celebration that the sagas describe as a fine one. There was food and drink and company, and for a while, the Greenlandic winter must have felt a little lighter. It was a good match by any measure. Gudrid brought with her a reputation for wisdom and steadiness. Karlsefni brought resources, ships, and ambition. Together, they had the means to do something that had been talked about in Greenland for years. They could sail to Vinland. And so, not long after their marriage, that is exactly what they planned to do. The preparations for the voyage took time. This was not a small undertaking. Sailing to Vinland meant crossing open ocean to a land that had only been visited briefly before. It meant taking enough people, enough provisions, enough animals and tools and supplies to attempt something that no one had quite managed yet. A real settlement, a lasting one. Karlsefni was thorough in his preparations. He gathered a company of men and women. The numbers given in the sagas vary a little, but it was a substantial group, somewhere in the range of 60 to 160 people, depending on which account you follow. There were men who could farm and hunt and fish. There were women who could manage a household and help build a community. There were animals, cattle, almost certainly, livestock that could be bred and maintained if the settlement was to become permanent. They loaded the ships carefully. They thought about what they would need: food for the crossing, tools for building, weapons for protection. And then, when the season was right, they sailed. The route to Vinland was not entirely unknown by this point. Leif Eriksson had sailed it. Others had followed in his wake, or attempted to. The broad shape of it was understood. You sailed west and slightly south from Greenland. You followed the coastline of the land that appeared. You moved through waters that grew gradually less cold. The first land they encountered after leaving Greenland was a place of flat stones, great grey slabs of rock with no vegetation worth mentioning. The sagas call it Helluland, stone slab land. It corresponded, most likely, to what we now call Baffin Island. They did not stop there. There was nothing to stop for. They continued south along the coast. The landscape began to change. The rock gave way to something softer. Forests appeared, trees growing down to the shore, which was remarkable to people from Greenland, where trees were almost non-existent. This forested stretch of coast the sagas call Markland, forest land. It corresponds, in the thinking of most scholars, to the coast of Labrador. Again, they pressed on, following the coast southward and westward, until they found something that felt different. A place where the land was welcoming, where there was grass and timber and fresh water, where wild grapes grew, or at least some kind of berry that the Norse found pleasing. This was Vinland, and here, Karlsefni and Gudrid and their company came ashore and began to build. The exact location of Vinland has been debated for a very long time. For many years, it was thought to be purely legendary, a story, something the sagas had embellished beyond recognition. But in the 1960s, a Norwegian explorer and his wife discovered something remarkable on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in Canada. At a place called Longs o Meadows, they found the remains of Norse buildings, turf structures of the kind that Norse people built in Greenland and Iceland. There were artifacts, iron nails, a spindle whorl for spinning thread. The site was excavated carefully over the following years, and what emerged was unmistakable. This was a Norse settlement, 1,000 years old, on the shores of North America. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Whether Longs o Meadows is the precise Vinland of the sagas, or a base camp from which further exploration was conducted, is still discussed. But it proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Norse people had been in North America centuries before Columbus, and it is almost certainly connected to the voyages described in the sagas, the voyages that Gudrid was part of. The settlement at Vinland was built with purpose. Houses went up. The Norse were experienced builders in turf and timber, and the materials were available here in a way they simply were not in Greenland. Trees could be felled. Timber could be cut and shaped. The work was hard, but it was the kind of work these people knew. They settled into the rhythms of the new place. There was fishing. There was hunting. The land around them offered things that Greenland could not. And then, in that new world, something happened that made the settlement not just a historical footnote, but something more personal, more human, more lasting. Gudrid gave birth to a child, a boy. He was given the name Snorri. Snorri Thorfinnsson is believed to be the first child of European descent born in the Americas. His birth on those shores is one of the quiet miracles of medieval history. A small life, beginning at the edge of the known world, in a place that most of the people back in Greenland and Iceland didn't yet have words for. Gudrid had carried him through the ocean crossing. She had made a home in a strange land, and she had brought new life into it. Life in Vinland was not simple, though. The Norse were not alone there. They encountered the indigenous people of that land. The sagas call them by a name that translates roughly as Skraelings. It is not a kind name, and it tells us something about the perspective from which the sagas were written. These were the people who had lived in that part of the world for a very long time. They knew it. They moved through it. And when the Norse appeared on their shores, they took notice. The first contacts were cautious on both sides. There was curiosity. There was also wariness. The Norse had weapons and unfamiliar animals. The indigenous people had their own knowledge, their own numbers, their own ways of reading the newcomers. For a while, there was trade. The sagas describe exchanges of goods, cloth and milk from the Norse, furs from the Skrælings. It was uneasy, but it was functional. But the peace did not hold. The sagas are not entirely consistent about what went wrong and why. There are accounts of misunderstandings, of fear on both sides, of a moment when something tipped, and the fragile coexistence became conflict. There was violence. People died on both sides. The Norse were outnumbered, or at least sufficiently threatened, to make their position in Vinland feel precarious. The sagas contain one of their most memorable moments during this period. During one of the confrontations with the Skrælings, when some of the Norse men were beginning to give way, a woman stepped forward. The sagas give us her name as Freydis. She was a daughter of Eric the Red, which made her a member of the same family constellation as Thorstein, Gudrid's late husband. She was a forceful and unconventional figure, and in this moment of fear, she acted in a way that stopped the retreat. The details are vivid and a little unsettling, and we don't need to dwell on them at length. What matters is that the moment captures something about the nature of life in Vinland. It was not peaceful. It was not easy. The world these Norse people had sailed into was not empty or available in the way they might have imagined. After 2 or 3 winters in Vinland, Karlsefni made a decision. They would leave. The tension with the indigenous population had made the settlement too difficult to sustain. The Norse were a long way from any support or reinforcement. They were a small group in an enormous and unfamiliar landscape, surrounded by people who had good reason not to welcome them. The dream of a permanent settlement, for now, was over. It was a significant moment, not a dramatic one, necessarily. More a quiet recognition that the world had not arranged itself the way they had hoped, that the distance was too great, the numbers too few, the situation too uncertain. They loaded the ships. They gathered what they had, and they sailed back east, toward Greenland. Gudrid carried her son Snorri back across the ocean with her. He had been born in the New World and was now leaving it, not yet old enough to understand what that meant. The settlement at Vinland was abandoned. It would not be seriously attempted again. The Norse would continue to visit the coasts of North America for timber and other resources for some time to come. But the dream of planting a lasting community there, of making it part of the Norse world in the way that Greenland had been made part of it, quietly faded. What remained was the memory, the stories, the sagas that would eventually be written down and preserved, and Gudrid herself, sailing home with a child in her arms, carrying everything she had seen and done and survived. They returned to Greenland for a time. The community there received them. Life settled back into the rhythms of the farms and the fjords. The extraordinary voyage became something to speak of in the evenings, something to place in the family memory. But Greenland was not where Gudrid's story ended. Karlsefni eventually decided to leave Greenland for good. He and Gudrid, with their son Snorri, sailed back to Iceland. They settled in the north of the country, at a farm that became their permanent home. It was a good life by the measures of the time. Karlsefni was a man of reputation and resources. The farm prospered. There were more children, though Snorri remained the firstborn, and the one most closely tied to the story of Vinland. Gudrid had come a long way, from the Snæfellsnes Peninsula of her childhood, across the sea to Greenland. further still to the shores of North America, and now back to the island where she had been born. She had circled something vast. The sagas tell us that she and Karlsefni lived well together, that their household was respected, that the farm in the north of Iceland became a place of some standing in the community. And then, after some years of this settled life, Gudrid did something that surprised even the people who knew her well. She left again. This time the journey was not westward, but eastward. Gudrid became a pilgrim. After Karlsefni died, she made the decision to undertake the great Christian pilgrimage to Rome. This was one of the most significant journeys a medieval Christian could make. It was long and difficult and expensive. It required crossing the sea to continental Europe, then traveling overland through kingdoms and territories that were very different from anything an Icelander would have known. The roads of medieval Europe were not gentle things. They passed through forests and mountain passes, through towns and monasteries, through landscapes shaped by a civilization older and denser, and more layered than the Norse world of Iceland and Greenland. Gudrid walked them. We don't know exactly what route she took, or precisely when this pilgrimage occurred. The sagas are not detailed on this point, but the fact of it is recorded. She went to Rome. She completed the pilgrimage. She visited the holy sites that medieval Christianity considered the most sacred in the Western world. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. Here was a woman who had grown up on the edge of the medieval world, who had crossed the North Atlantic, who had stood on the shores of North America, who had survived the loss of 2 husbands, the hardships of Greenland, the tensions of Vinland, and now she was walking the roads of Europe, alone, or nearly so, making her way to the center of the Christian world. The woman who sang the old Norse chant for the völva in Greenland, who had one foot in the ancient beliefs of her people and one foot in the new faith, was now completing one of Christianity's great acts of devotion. She was, in some quiet way, holding all of it together. The old world and the new faith, the wild western ocean and the ancient roads of Europe, the life she had been given and the choices she had made within it. She came home to Iceland. After the pilgrimage, after Rome, she returned to the north of Iceland where the farm was, and there she made one final change to her life. She became an anchoress. An anchoress was a woman who chose to live a life of religious solitude and prayer. It was a serious commitment in the medieval Christian world, a withdrawal from ordinary life into a kind of devoted stillness. She would have lived simply, in a small cell or hermitage, spending her days in prayer and quiet reflection. It was, in its way, the most dramatic turn of all. After a life of extraordinary movement, after all those oceans and coastlines and strange lands and long roads, after all the crossings and the losses and the new beginnings, she chose, at the end, to be still. There is something very peaceful about that image. The old woman in her small cell, in the north of Iceland, with the sound of the wind outside and the silence of her own choosing within. The world she had known was still moving around her. Iceland in the early 11th century was a society in the middle of its own changes. Christianity had settled more firmly into the fabric of life. Churches were being built. The old rituals and ceremonies were fading, or at least moving to the edges of things. The rhythms of the farming year continued as they always had, but they were marked now by Christian feast days, and the observance of a calendar that connected this remote island to the wider sweep of European civilization. Gudrid would have been aware of all of this. Even in her solitude, the world was not entirely shut out. People came and went from the farm. News travelled slowly, from ship to ship and farm to farm. The community around her continued its quiet life, but her own world had grown small by choice. And in that smallness, there was something that the sagas seemed to quietly honour. Her son Snorri grew up on the farm in northern Iceland. He had been born at the furthest edge of the known world, but he lived out his life in the more familiar landscape of his parents' homeland. He married. He had children of his own, and those children had children. The sagas tell us that from Snorri's line came people of significance in Icelandic society, bishops among others, people who held positions of learning and spiritual authority in the centuries that followed. This was what the völva had spoken of in that cold Greenlandic winter long before, that Gudrid's descendants would be numerous and distinguished. The words, whatever their origin, turned out to reflect something true about how her life would branch outward through time. She could not have known all of this as she sat in her hermitage in the north of Iceland. She could not have traced the lines forward to see what her children and grandchildren would become. But she had lived long enough and seen enough to know that life continued beyond any individual moment of it, that what you put into the world had a way of persisting. The date of Gudrid's death is not recorded precisely. This is not surprising. The recording of such details was inconsistent in that era, particularly for women who were not queens or abbesses or figures of formal institutional power. Gudrid was remarkable, but she was remarkable in ways that didn't always leave clear documentary traces. What the sagas give us is the shape of her life, the arc of it, the beginning in western Iceland, the crossings to Greenland, the extraordinary voyage to Vinland, the return, the pilgrimage, the final quietness. She likely lived well into middle age at least, given all that she accomplished after her years of active travel. Some scholars have suggested she may have lived into her 60s or beyond, though we cannot be certain. What matters, perhaps, is less the precise date and more the fact of how fully she lived, how much she moved through, how much she encountered and endured and continued past. The sagas that preserved her story were written down in the 13th century, roughly 200 years after the events they describe. By then, Gudrid would have been a figure of family memory, a name passed down through generations, attached to stories that grew and shifted slightly with each retelling, as all oral traditions do. The two accounts we have, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, don't agree on every detail. They emphasize different things. They give slightly different versions of certain events. This is the nature of memory. It is not a single clean line, but something more like a river with multiple channels, all moving in roughly the same direction, but not always following exactly the same course. What's striking is how consistently both sagas return to Gudrid as someone of weight and importance. She is not a background figure. She is not simply someone's wife or someone's daughter. She is present in the stories in her own right. She makes decisions. She acts. She speaks. For a medieval woman, this is notable. The historical record of that era tends to thin out considerably when it comes to women. They are often present only as connections between men, as mothers, wives, daughters, mentioned briefly and then set aside. Gudrid is not set aside. She is remembered as herself. There is a moment in the sagas that stays with many people who read them carefully. It comes after Gudrid has returned from her pilgrimage to Rome. She is back in Iceland. She is old, or at least older. The great journeys are behind her. Her son Snorri asks her about her life, about what she has seen and experienced. The sagas indicate that she spoke of her travels, that she gave him an account of the things she had witnessed and done. It is described briefly, as so many of the most important moments in the sagas are. But there is something in that image that feels true and warm. A mother and son, somewhere in the north of Iceland, with the long story of her life moving between them like something handed from one pair of hands to another. This is, in some ways, how the sagas themselves came to be, through exactly these kinds of conversations, through the patient transmission of memory from one generation to the next, through someone deciding that a life was worth telling, and another person deciding it was worth hearing. Gudrid told her story, and it survived. What do we make of her from this distance? She lived in a world without the tools we use to measure significance. There were no newspapers to report on her voyages, no official records to document her pilgrimage, no portraits, no formal titles. What she had was a life lived with remarkable range and steadiness. She moved through the medieval world in ways that almost no one else of her era managed. She crossed the North Atlantic multiple times. She reached the shores of a continent that most of the world would not know existed for another 5 centuries. She walked the roads of Europe to Rome, and she ended her days in the quiet of a hermitage in northern Iceland. She was, across all of it, recognizably herself. Calm, capable, present. A woman who met each new situation without being destroyed by it. Who lost people she loved and continued. Who sailed into the unknown and came back. The völva's prophecy had called her life good. And by the measure of what a life can contain, it was. There is something comforting, somehow, about the fact that her story survived at all. So much from that era is simply gone, lost to time, to fire, to neglect. The vast majority of the people who lived in that world left no trace at all. They were born and worked and loved and died, and the world moved on without remembering them. Gudrid was remembered, not because she was a queen, not because she commanded armies or accumulated wealth or held any formal power over others, but because she lived in a way that the people around her found worth preserving, because she was the kind of person whose presence in a story made the story better, more human, more true, and because someone, at some point, decided to write it down. She remains, 1,000 years later, a figure of quiet fascination. In Iceland, she is known and honored. The region where she was born and where she eventually settled still carries connections to her memory. There have been statues and commemorations. The Norse exploration of North America, which she was so central to, has become an important part of how Iceland understands its own history and its place in the larger story of the world. In North America, at the site of Lance o' Meadows in Newfoundland, visitors walk the ground where Norse people stood 1,000 years ago, where Gudrid may well have stood, where her son Snorri was almost certainly born. The landscape there is open and windswept. The sea is visible. The grass moves in the breeze off the water. It is a quiet place, a beautiful one, in the spare and austere way that northern coastlines tend to be beautiful. Standing there, it is not difficult to imagine the ships arriving, the people coming ashore, the work of building beginning, a woman among them, capable and steady, carrying whatever she carried inside her across all that cold grey water. The world Gudrid moved through was not gentle. It was a world of real hardship, of cold and hunger and illness and loss, of sea crossings that could go wrong at any moment, of communities built on the knife edge of survival, of relationships shaped by necessity and circumstance as much as by feeling. And yet the sagas, when they speak of Gudrid, do not give us a figure defined by suffering. They give us someone who moved through hardship without being hardened by it, who remained, through everything, a person of warmth and wisdom and steadiness. That is its own kind of achievement, perhaps the most quietly remarkable thing about her. As we come to the end of her story, it feels right to let it settle slowly, rather than bring it to any sharp conclusion. Her life was not sharp. It was long and curved and wide. It took her places that seem almost impossible for a single life to contain. And it brought her, in the end, to stillness, the hermitage in northern Iceland, a small space of her own choosing, the prayers and the quiet and the long view of a life fully lived. Outside, the Icelandic wind would have moved across the hills as it always had. The seasons would have turned. The light would have changed. The sea, somewhere not far off, would have gone on being the sea. And Gudrid, who had crossed it more times than almost anyone alive in her era, would have listened to it from her small and chosen room, perhaps with something like gratitude, perhaps with something like peace. We don't know what she thought or felt in those final years. The sagas don't tell us, but they tell us enough to know that she had earned whatever quiet she found there. She had lived, fully and widely, and without turning away from what the world placed in front of her. And 1,000 years later, on a quiet night, her story is still worth telling, still worth listening to, still worth the slow and gentle time it takes to sit with a life this full. Thank you for spending this evening with Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. If you're still with us now, wherever you are, we hope the night around you feels a little softer, a little quieter. Rest well. We'll be here again soon, with another life to follow, another story to settle into. Good night.